When a woman insulted a quiet old man in a first-class line, she never expected his response to leave her speechless, until she realized who he was. The airport was alive with the energy of a busy morning. Families herded kids clutching backpacks and stuffed animals. Business travelers balanced phone calls with coffee cups, and the overhead announcements added a steady background hum to the chaos. Amidst this organized frenzy, a blonde woman in her early 40s strode through the terminal with an air of purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and designer jeans, her handbag, a symbol of understated luxury, swinging lightly at her side. Everything about her screamed confidence, from her poised posture to the way her eyes barely flicked toward the people she passed. She approached the first-class boarding line, pausing just long enough to adjust the strap of her handbag. Her gaze quickly swept over the small queue ahead, assessing her competition for priority seating. It wasn't a long line, but something caught her attention. A man standing at the very front. His back was turned, but his figure stood out. He wasn't tall or imposing, but there was a sturdiness about him, even as he stood still. He wore a worn leather jacket, a faded shirt, and jeans that had clearly seen their fair share of years. He carried a small, unassuming bag slung over his shoulder. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance, nothing that matched the polished image the blonde woman likely associated with first-class travel. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she took in the sight. She couldn't help herself. She sighed audibly, loud enough for anyone nearby to notice. With a quick glance at the boarding sign, as if to confirm she was indeed in the right line, she muttered under her breath, "Why do they let just anyone in first class these days?" The words weren't particularly loud, but they carried a sharp edge. A couple standing behind her exchanged a glance but said nothing. The man at the front of the line didn't turn around, though there was a subtle shift in his stance, almost imperceptible, as if he'd heard but chose not to react. The woman clicked her tongue softly, her impatience growing. She shifted her weight to one foot, the toe of her designer heel tapping lightly on the floor. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about her irritation. She wasn't used to waiting, and certainly not behind someone she had already judged unworthy of standing in that line. A gate agent moved into position, preparing to begin the boarding process. The blonde woman glanced at her watch, then at the man again, her frustration simmering just below the surface. She tilted her head slightly, her expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance. She muttered again, louder this time, "What's the point of first class if they're just going to let anyone in?" Her voice carried farther than she intended, drawing the attention of a few more passengers nearby. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to involve themselves in whatever was unfolding. Others, however, lingered a moment longer, curious about how the scene might play out. Still, the man at the front of the line didn't react. His stillness only seemed to fuel her irritation further. The atmosphere grew tense, like the charged air before a storm. The woman's presence, once commanding and confident, now felt overbearing, her words laced with entitlement. Yet, despite her visible attempts to assert dominance over the moment, the man remained a picture of calm. He adjusted the strap of his bag, but didn't so much as glance back. And while the blonde woman saw only an unremarkable figure in front of her, everyone else was about to witness the moment when assumptions collided with reality. The blonde woman's patience, thin as it was to begin with, now seemed to be wearing away completely. Her foot tapping grew more pronounced, each sharp click echoing against the polished tile floor. She cast another glance at the older man ahead, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if his very presence was an affront to her carefully curated world. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head with exaggerated disapproval. "What's next? Are they just going to let anyone wander into first class now?" Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried a deliberate sharpness, designed to sting. A few heads turned at her words. The passengers nearby, most pretending to focus on their phones or boarding passes, couldn't help but sneak glances toward her and the man she was directing her comments toward. Whispers began to ripple softly through the small crowd. "Did you hear that? Who does she think she is? Wait, is that—" But the man remained motionless, his back still to her, his stance steady and composed. He adjusted the worn strap of his bag slightly, a subtle movement that seemed to signal he had heard her, though he gave no further indication. His silence wasn't out of obliviousness. It was deliberate, almost purposeful. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. He simply waited. This only seemed to embolden the woman further. She stepped closer just enough to make her presence impossible to ignore. Her designer handbag swung slightly at her side, and she crossed her arms in an exaggerated display of irritation. "You'd think people would understand when they don't belong somewhere," she said, louder now, her words echoing clearly. "First class is supposed to mean something." Her voice cut through the hum of airport activity like a knife, and this time, there was no mistaking who she was addressing. A man near the back of the line muttered under his breath, "She's really doing this, isn't she?" His companion nodded silently, their shared expression one of disbelief. The gate agent looked up from their computer briefly, their professional demeanor masking any visible reaction. A couple near the front exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Yet through all of this, the man at the center of the woman's ire remained calm. He neither turned nor spoke, his stillness now bordering on defiant. It was a kind of quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be announced. The woman's irritation reached its peak. She let out a dry laugh, one that dripped with condescension, and took another small step closer. "Seriously, what is this? A charity line? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," she said, glancing around as though searching for validation. But if she expected agreement, she was sorely disappointed. The silence around her was thick, the kind that comes when people are too stunned to respond. And still, the man gave no reaction. He simply stood there, an unmovable figure in the face of her growing storm. His quiet demeanor only seemed to enrage her further, her frustration now mingling with a faint sense of unease. She was used to getting a rise out of people, to seeing her words land with the force she intended. But this man, this ordinary-looking stranger, was unfazed. It was as if her insults couldn't touch him. The tension in the boarding area grew palpable, the kind of pressure that could only build for so long before something snapped. The blonde woman, oblivious to the attention she had drawn, crossed her arms tighter, her expression hardening into a look of smug satisfaction. She was certain she had the upper hand in this unspoken battle. But what she couldn't know was that the man's silence wasn't weakness. It was a calm before the storm, and his next move would turn her confidence into something far more fragile. The older man turned slowly, the kind of deliberate, unhurried movement that seemed designed to capture every ounce of attention. It was as though the air itself stilled, everyone waiting to see what he would do next. The blonde woman, still wearing her smug expression, tilted her head slightly, her irritation tempered by a hint of curiosity. She hadn't expected him to respond at all. When he finally faced her, the full weight of his presence became clear. His face, weathered but striking, carried an undeniable sense of familiarity. Deep lines etched his features, not as a sign of frailty, but as a testament to a life well lived. His piercing eyes locked onto hers with a calm intensity that made her falter, her confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about him, a quiet authority that demanded respect, even without him saying a word. And yet, it wasn't just his demeanor that caught her off guard. It was his face. As she stared at him, recognition began to flicker in her mind, slow at first, but growing rapidly. He let the moment linger, giving her enough time to connect the dots. The whispers that had been buzzing softly through the line grew louder now, like an approaching wave. "Wait a second. Is that who I think it is? Oh my God, it is him! Is that Clint Eastwood?" The blonde woman's smirk faded, replaced by a look of confusion. Then, like a lightning bolt, it hit her. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Her earlier bravado now felt like a distant memory as embarrassment flushed her cheeks. Clint held her gaze, his expression unreadable but steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had nothing to prove. "You know," he began, his words cutting through the stunned silence like a knife, "I've learned something in all my years. It doesn't matter how much money you have, how fancy your clothes are, or what ticket you're holding. Respect? That's what separates the decent from the rest." His words weren't loud, but they carried an impact far greater than volume could provide. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. His voice, steeped in a lifetime of experience, made it impossible to dismiss or ignore. The blonde woman's cheeks flushed a deeper red. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could she say? The very man she had so arrogantly dismissed moments earlier had just turned her entire argument on its head with a single, devastatingly calm statement. Around them, the murmurs grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, some discreetly snapping photos or recording the scene. But no one interrupted. It was as if the entire line understood they were witnessing something more significant than a petty airport altercation. You don't judge people by how they look, Clint continued, his gaze unwavering. You judge them by how they treat others. That's the only standard that's ever mattered, and the only one that ever will. The woman's composure crumbled further. Her arms, once defiantly crossed, now hung limply at her sides. She glanced around nervously, her earlier arrogance now replaced by a visible discomfort. She wanted to melt into the floor, to undo the words she had spoken. But there was no escape from the weight of Clint's words, or the judgmental stares of the people around her. For Clint, it wasn't about humiliating her. He wasn't angry or spiteful. There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet conviction that came from years of living by the very principles he was now preaching. His words weren't meant to wound, they were meant to teach. But even though he had made his point, Clint wasn't finished. His next words would deliver a lesson that no one there would ever forget. The silence that followed Clint's words was deafening. It was as if the entire airport terminal had paused to witness the moment, the weight of his statement settling heavily over everyone within earshot. The blonde woman stood frozen, her polished facade completely shattered. The confidence that once radiated from her was now replaced by a palpable discomfort. She shifted awkwardly on her heels, her gaze flickering to the floor as if searching for an escape route. Clint didn't move right away. His piercing gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer, not in anger, but as if to give her time to absorb his words. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned back toward the gate agent, his presence commanding even in its quietness. The blonde woman, however, was left grappling with her own emotions. Her face was flushed, and the air of superiority she had carried earlier was now completely gone. She was no longer the self-assured traveler who had strutted to the front of the line, confident in her place among the elite. Instead, she looked vulnerable, exposed. The realization of who she had insulted and the gravity of his response had hit her like a tidal wave. Around them, the crowd began to stir. The whispers grew louder as people exchanged glances and murmured their disbelief. Some were still trying to process the surreal moment of seeing Clint Eastwood in person. Others were marveling at the unexpected moral lesson that had just unfolded in front of them. "Did you hear what he said? That was incredible. I've always admired him, but seeing this? Wow. She deserved it, though, didn't she? Well, maybe she'll think twice next time." The woman could feel the judgmental stares of the other passengers. Every whispered comment seemed to pierce her like a dagger, each one reminding her of her earlier arrogance. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to assert her own status, and now she was paying the price. But it wasn't just the embarrassment that stung. It was the truth in Clint's words. As the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Clint stepped forward. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered once throughout the entire ordeal. Just as he handed over his ticket, he paused, glancing back at the blonde woman, who was now standing awkwardly to the side. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady and without an ounce of sarcasm. "Take my spot." The crowd's collective gasp was almost audible. No one had expected that. Not after what she had said, not after how she had acted. Even the woman herself seemed stunned. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she didn't move, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Seriously," Clint added, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Go on. You look like you're in a hurry." The words were simple, but the gesture carried a profound weight. It wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a lesson in humility, a final reminder of what respect truly meant. The blonde woman hesitated, her cheeks still burning with shame. She glanced at Clint, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but there was none. His offer was genuine. Thank you, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward cautiously, clutching her handbag tightly as if it could shield her from the weight of the moment. As she handed her ticket to the gate agent, she avoided eye contact with everyone around her. The crowd remained silent, watching the interaction unfold. Clint stepped back slightly, allowing her to board first. He didn't say another word, but his actions spoke volumes. The passengers who had witnessed the scene were left in awe, their admiration for him growing tenfold. As the woman disappeared down the jet bridge, the whispers began again, but this time they carried a tone of respect. Can you believe that? What a class act. That's why he's Clint Eastwood. Absolute legend. I hope she learned something from this. Clint, however, didn't seem concerned with the chatter around him. He handed his ticket to the gate agent and walked toward the plane with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the entire encounter. But for the blonde woman, the real consequences of this moment were only just beginning. As the plane took off and settled into its steady climb, the blonde woman sat silently in her plush first-class seat. The usual excitement of the luxurious experience, hot towels, chilled champagne, the attentive flight attendants, seemed muted now. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, circling back again and again to the man she had so casually dismissed. Clint Eastwood. She still couldn't believe it. She glanced around the cabin, avoiding the curious gazes of the other passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior. Their looks weren't overt, but she felt them nonetheless, subtle reminders of the embarrassment she couldn't escape. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly exposed, not because of what others thought of her, but because of what Clint had made her see about herself. The words he had spoken played on a loop in her head. Respect doesn't cost a thing. But the lack of it? That can get real expensive. She had heard plenty of platitudes in her life, but this one hit differently. It wasn't just a cliché, it was a mirror, reflecting her own flaws back at her. She thought about the way she had spoken to him, the way she had judged him before knowing anything about him. In her world, appearances had always been everything. The right clothes, the right car, the right connections. They were badges of success, symbols that she had made it. But Clint's calm, unshakable presence had shown her that true success wasn't about those things. It was about something deeper, something she had lost sight of. She sipped her champagne absent-mindedly, the bubbly liquid offering no comfort. Her thoughts drifted to other moments in her life, times when she had acted the same way, judging people by their outward appearance, dismissing them because they didn't fit her idea of what was worthy. How many times had she been the person who looked down on someone, assuming they didn't belong? The answer was too uncomfortable to admit, even to herself. Across the aisle, Clint Eastwood sat quietly in his seat, a paperback book resting in his lap. His demeanor was so unassuming that if she hadn't known who he was, she might have overlooked him again. That realization stung. How many other people had she overlooked? How many stories had she missed because she was too busy making assumptions? She thought back to the moment he had offered her his spot in line. It wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a lesson. He could have ignored her, let her stew in her own embarrassment, or even retaliated with harsh words. Instead, he had chosen to rise above it. His actions had spoken louder than any argument could have, showing her the power of grace in the face of disrespect. The blonde woman leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, replaced by a quiet resolve. She didn't want to be that person anymore, the one who judged, dismissed, and assumed. Clint's words had done more than just humble her. They had sparked a desire to change. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, her fingers hovering over the screen. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. Then slowly she began to type. Today, I learned a lesson I didn't know I needed. Respect isn't about who you are or what you have. It's about how you treat people. And it doesn't cost a thing. The words felt simple, but they carried the weight of her realization. She saved the note and set her phone down, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, She felt like she was moving toward becoming a better version of herself. Across the aisle, Clint turned a page in his book, completely unaware of the internal reckoning he had inspired. Or maybe he was. Either way, he didn't need recognition. The lesson had been delivered, and that was enough for him. But what mattered now wasn't just what she had learned. It was how she would choose to carry that lesson forward. The flight continued on in its quiet hum, but for the blonde woman, the world felt different now. As she sat in her plush seat, her mind replayed the encounter over and over. Each word Clint Eastwood had spoken was etched into her memory, not as a scolding but as a truth she could no longer ignore. She realized she had been looking at life all wrong, not just at the airport but in so many small, everyday interactions. For years she had chased status and validation, measuring her worth by the luxury she could afford and the people she could impress. The labels she wore, the car she drove, the way others looked at her, it all felt like proof of her success. Yet in that airport line, Clint's calm words had stripped all of that away. In a single moment, he had shown her that true value had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with character. She glanced over at Clint again, still sitting across the aisle with his book in hand. He wasn't seeking attention or soaking up the whispers of admiration from the other passengers. He was just present, unbothered and quietly grounded in himself. The humility in that was something she had never truly understood before now. She realized that real power didn't come from demanding respect. It came from earning it, from embodying it. Her mind wandered to the people in her life, her colleagues, her friends, even strangers she had brushed past without a second thought. She thought about the times she had made snide remarks or dismissed someone because they didn't meet her expectations. How many of those moments had been like the one in the airport? How many times had she hurt someone or diminished them without even realizing it? The thought weighed heavily on her, but it also gave her a strange sense of clarity. This was her chance to change, to stop being the person who judged and instead become someone who listened, respected, and understood. It wouldn't erase the past, but it could shape her future. As the plane began its descent, she felt a sense of resolve take root. She wouldn't let this moment pass her by. She would carry Clint's words with her, not just as a memory, but as a guide for how to treat others moving forward. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to begin somewhere. By the time the plane touched down, her perspective had shifted. She stood up to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment and caught Clint's eye as he adjusted his own. For a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to say anything, but then she took a deep breath and turned to him. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but sincere. "For what you said back there. I needed to hear it." Clint looked at her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he gave her a small, understanding smile. "We all need reminders sometimes," he replied simply. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As she exited the plane and walked through the terminal, she felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of her old habits was beginning to lift. The encounter had left its mark on her, and she was determined to let it shape her into a better person. Back at the gate, Clint walked calmly toward the baggage claim, his stride unhurried and his demeanor unchanged. He didn't need acknowledgement or applause. For him, the real value wasn't in being right. It was in planting a seed of change, because in the end, respect isn't just about how you treat others. It's about who you choose to become and the impact you leave behind. Life is filled with moments that test who we are and reveal who we can be. Clint Eastwood's quiet wisdom in this story reminds us that respect, kindness, and humility aren't just virtues. They're necessities for living a life that truly matters. His actions show that the smallest gestures can create the biggest changes, inspiring others to reflect on their own choices. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how you treat the people around you. Small changes can lead to big transformations, and it all begins with respect. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to hear more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Together, let's build a kinder, more thoughtful community. Because respect truly costs nothing but means everything.